Putin has signed a decree putting 150,000 Russians into the conscription pipeline. Just what does this mean for the war in Ukraine? How can Ukraine push back against such a large Russian military force? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. So this is sort of the big story. Putin signs a decree to conscript 150,000 Russians for military service. Now, this is there's like three layers to this, right? The top layer sounds pretty bad, given that the entire Russian force currently in Ukraine is about 300,000 Russians. So this would be a 50% increase in the fighting forces currently deployed to Ukraine. And given that Ukraine has said now it's having a hard time contending against the current Russian army, it seems like pretty bad news. But let's peel back one layer of the onion, right? This is part of Russia's standard semi-annual conscription cycle. Now, what's interesting is this is actually a legal requirement. All Russian men 18 to 30 have 1 year of mandatory military service, although lots and lots of Russians find ways to avoid serving, right? Think about the U.S. and Vietnam, the classic flat feet or, serious mental illness or, take your pick of ways to get out of it, right? College, I think starting a family. I don't know what the rules are in Russia, but certainly if there's one thing we can count on, one thing we know about the Russian state, it's that if you're really rich, there are plenty of outs. There are plenty of workarounds, right? But what's interesting is in July, Russia actually raised the maximum age for conscripts from 27 to 30. And that's probably to try to grab a cohort that might have carve-outs like education. They might have said, listen, you can stretch your education, a couple extra years, but, if you're still in college at 30, nah, dude, you don't get to, even 30 would mean, even if you stuck around to get a PhD, you should still be done at that point, right? So it's meant to probably capture a larger population who works through some of these loopholes. But here's the thing. By law, conscripts mobilized as part of this routine conscription campaign, per Russian law, are not allowed to be sent abroad to fight. That includes Ukraine. Interesting, because, again, Russia can never really decide if the occupied Ukrainian regions are a part of Russia or not, right? Because remember, when they were first occupied, they were actually declared themselves independent republics. And Russia said, we're coming to the aid of independent republics on our border. Then Russia came in and said, actually, no, they're not independent republics. We had a referendum and conveniently 97% of the people there voted that they're now part of the Russian Federation, which would mean that being sent to fight there presumably would not violate this portion of Russian law. So again, the ability of the Russian state to work around, finagle, choose when to interpret certain things as true is just astounding. It's also kind of fascinating because, as we've talked about, these regions that Russia declared part of Russian sovereign territory don't actually have borders. There's never been a map, an official map that says these are the borders of these countries, right? And these provinces or whatever Russia's calling them. And that's because Russia has absolutely no control over any of them. Now, the UK's Ministry of Defense Intelligence, right, talked about how it says at least hundreds of these mobilized conscripts have likely served in Ukraine because of, quote, administrative mix-ups or after being coerced to sign contracts. And we've heard of stories of both of those things, but I think there's a little bit more to it, right? The last round of conscription conducted in September 23 saw 130,000 men called up to serve, and this campaign included citizens in the illegally annexed, right, Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia oblasts. Again, very weird to be like, okay, you're conscripted. Legally, you can't be sent abroad to fight, but you can be conscripted from the occupied region. Do you see how insane this Russian occupation falsity is? And it's really transparently bad. The UK's intelligence agency or defense intelligence agency also says that Russia's likely recruiting around 30,000 new soldiers a month, right? And that itself is an insane number. And again, around 1,000 new recruits daily, meaning that Russia can absorb a lot of losses, right? So when you see 1,000 casualties a day coming out of the front, you know that that is just mowing the grass for Ukraine. And you understand then why Ukraine so badly needs more munitions. So, but here, let's peel off the final layer of this onion that this article doesn't really talk about. And the final layer is that when you look at conscripts, right? Conscripts themselves are still valuable to this Russian recruitment effort. Why is that? Well, you can't send a conscript to fight. It's true. But these troops, right? For example, let's say you were a conscript in September 2023. That means that in about 6 months, your mandatory service is going to end. What will that mean? That will mean that you are going to leave the military service. You are going to be trained. You're going to be proficient. You're going to have a military specialty. And I guarantee that every single one of those conscripts, as their service time ends, they get sat down by a recruiter. And that recruiter goes, listen, buddy, let me tell you about the benefits of serving in Ukraine. We'll pay you dozens of rubles. Your family will get all kinds of, right? They'll promise them the world, right? And they will do everything they can to get those guys to sign these contracts. And functionally, that will mean that for a lot of these guys, right? Let's say you get 150,000, right? And you get 20% of them to sign up, right? That means, and if you get, again, every 6 months you get 150,000. Let's even be more generous, right? Let's say 10%, 1 in 10, you finish their service and Russia coerces them to stay on for another year or two as a contract soldier, right? That means that basically that 15,000 every 6 months represents what? An additional month basically of recruiting, right? So instead of getting 12, like that's like adding a 13th month to the year for Russia to draw soldiers from, right? It puts 30,000 more troops on the battlefield for Russia. Again, I'm estimating these numbers, but based on the reports I've heard, that's probably right. Because remember, some of those guys are going to say, nah, F that contract, I'm going back home. They go back home to their rural village. They're like, shit, what am I going to do for money? I got to work. And then they look around and they go, damn, there's no work here. And then they go back to the recruiter's office and they're like, listen, I know somebody who will pay me an okay salary. I know a job opening. And they go back to the recruiter's office. A lot of people are like that. And remember, for Russia, once they finish that mandatory service, again, they're trained. They don't need to be sent through additional training. They get a couple weeks of refresh and then off they go to the front. So for Russia, right, this 150,000, they're not going to be fighting in Ukraine this year, but those guys mobilized in September, they might be. Some of them are going to be fighting in Ukraine, and it's going to be more than hundreds, right? They're going to finish their service, and then it's not going to be hundreds, it's going to be thousands or even tens of thousands of those conscripts are going to end up fighting in Ukraine. And so these guys, again, 12 to 14 months from now, you're going to see this surge of folks in the fight. Now, the Ukrainian government has made it abundantly clear that there is a strategy to deal with these Russian waves of people, but it requires a little bit of help. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But if you need a little bit of help, hopefully you're not fighting waves of Russians. But if you need help crushing your workouts, getting focused, getting done what you have to, you want to check out Strike Gum. Strike Gum is sugar-free, 90 milligrams of caffeine in every piece, 100 milligrams of alpha GPC, one piece of gum. This is the equivalent of an energy drink, a Red Bull, an Amp Energy, right? That's how much caffeine is in here. So you throw it in your pocket, you throw it in your glove box, you throw it in your toolbox, and boom, you need a pick-me-up in the middle of the afternoon, you pop it, you chew it, it's a refreshing mint flavor, it's got zero sugar, it's not going to screw with your macros, it solves all sorts of problems that you have with energy drinks. And the best part is, this pack has the equivalent of 5 energy drinks in it, 5 pieces, right? To get that much, and from a Red Bull, you'd have to drop what, $25, $24, something like that, right? They're like $4.50 a pop now. They're so expensive. So go to strikegum.com, go to Amazon and search Strike Gum. I linked to all of it in the description. Check it out, especially if you buy on the website, right? We've got a discount for military. We've got a discount for first-time customers. So definitely check this out, right? Thanks to the dozens and dozens of people who've left us 5-star reviews on Amazon. You know that's huge on Amazon's platform. It tells everybody that we are one of the best premium caffeinated gums out there. And we see it, right? We have thousands and thousands of you guys who've reordered already, which is absolutely dope, right? But I knew it because I worked with this manufacturer. This isn't like a white label product. Literally, they sent me probably 6 to 8 different ingredients, samples, combinations. And I was like, this is the combo that I want. So this is like, there is no other Strike Gum. There is no off-label Strike Gum. It's totally, totally unique. And so let's talk a little bit about Zelensky's interview with the Washington Post, right? This dropped 2 days ago. And Zelensky said Ukraine really can't defend its territory without American support, right? We've talked about this, the European countries are supporting as best they can, but they don't have the defense industrial base. They don't have the defense infrastructure to really support this, right? Ukraine relies heavily on air defense systems from the United States, missiles from the United States like HIMARS, right? Electronic warfare jammers, something the U.S. has a lot of and is very proficient with thanks to the jamming tech used in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, the unbeatable 155 shells that the U.S. can produce. The U.S. is one of the only countries, frankly, that can produce 155 shells, right? Let's see, production in U.S. Let's see if we can get some numbers here. Right, the U.S. currently can put out about 28,000 rounds a month, right? And it's by the end of the year, we're going to see 70 to 80,000 rounds a month, right? But that is enough it's not enough to like carry the fight, but man, compared, for example, to give you an idea, the Czech Republic put out a news report that they sent Ukraine 10,000 shells, right? And that is so exceptional. It made the fucking news. So this is why the U.S. talks about like, hey, listen, why Ukraine says, listen, we appreciate the help from the Europeans, but guess what? Only one country has the factories to help us and keep it coming, and that's the United States. So hopefully, you can always write to your congressman, as we've talked about. I think that makes a difference, man. I'm telling you. It's an election year. If you tell your congressman, and I'm going to put the link to that in the description, that, I want to see Ukraine pass this aid bill, right? And as we've talked about, the negotiations on the back end, it sounds like basically the speaker has said, I'll do this deal, but I need both Republicans and Democrats to promise to protect my job from being ousted by these hard-line Republicans who I have no proof that they've been compromised by Russia, but man, they really seem to be stopping Ukraine aid. So, regardless of the party of your representative in the House, you should probably give them a little message, right? Never, it's free, it doesn't hurt, and you could do one line, right? You can even be like, don't respond, you don't need to respond, just be like, I support Ukraine aid, I'm a voter in your district, send. Anyway, Zelensky has said in this interview, right? He's like, he acknowledges that these material shortages are going to force the Ukrainian military to cede territory and fight a fighting retreat, right? He said a smaller but more stable front line is preferable to a larger but unstable front line that Russian forces could break through. And we've talked about this. This is a very, very effective strategy. As we've seen, when Ukraine sits there and goes, listen, we don't have to fight for every inch. Instead, we can yield some of this hard to defend territory, situate ourselves like in Avdiivka, where they situated themselves behind a river on a hilltop. The Russians just getting ground into the dirt there. And in the process, the Ukrainians inflicted a lot of casualties. We've looked at them on Combat Vet News, on the exclusive video platform, right? We've seen how effective that is. A lot of those Russians never even saw the Ukrainians that took them out, right? And it's a really effective strategy, but it means the Ukrainian forces have to start to yield areas. And you can't win a war giving up territory. You can't win a war walking away. You can win a war if you have to do it sometimes, right? Temporarily pivot to the defense. But Ukraine needs to know that there's going to be a way for them to turn around and bring the fight back to the Russians. And the Ukrainian military's planning ability and the decisions that they can make is contingent on U.S. military assistance, right? If you know you're going to have a bunch of weapons, you can plan to fight a more aggressive fight. And so Zelensky has made clear he needs this. There is no version of winning this war without not just Western assistance, but without U.S. assistance, right? And maybe in a year or 2 years, Europe can step up their ability to provide defense for Ukraine, where it's much less politically controversial because, frankly, the Europeans are on the same continent as Russia. It's a little scarier. But in the interval, there's only one country with the capacity to aid Ukraine, to allow Ukraine not just to put shells, put steel on domes, so to speak, but the ability to give them the air defenses needed to shoot down the dozens and dozens and dozens of Shahed drones and missiles and cruise missiles that Russia has really been using in spades. Anyway, guys, that is all I had for you. Thank you so much to the Colonel Tier members of Combat Vet News. Hit like on the video, hit subscribe, tell that algorithm that I make good content, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.